Good evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone. All right, there you are. So I must admit, I'm extremely excited to be in conversation with Khaled Beydoun, who's someone I've actually known for several years. And before we started this conversation, I promised him that this would be the most engaging and enlightening conversations he's had thus far on this very prolific book, I think. I met Khaled, I want to say maybe a decade or so ago
Mhm.
when you were an emerging scholar at UCLA Law School, I think a scholar in residence as part of the critical race theory program. And so it's been interesting to sort of watch the growth of his work and to kind of see the DNA emerge. And it's very apparent in this book that I'm dying to talk to you about. What's also very interesting about the career that you're holding at this moment is, as Tom mentioned, it's both being a public intellectual and a thought leader, but you also have a very vibrant social media presence, which oftentimes isn't something one sees with distinguished writers, and the ability for the audience and the community to engage. This conversation probably couldn't be more timely than ever before. And so I want to sort of just jump right in because as we think about, both this book and its content, it lives in a space both of where race, Muslim identity, democracy, and current affairs sort of merge.
Mhm.
And so my first question is a very simple one and a very basic one. Um, where do we find this book? Where is it listed in the bookstore? Under what
Mhm.
section? Because the breadth of it is so, dare I say, intersectional
Mhm.
on purpose. And so it's hard to kind of say it is that book or this book.
Mhm.
So I want to start there. What are you
Mhm.
trying to do with
Mhm.
American Islamophobia?
Mm. So first of all, thank you so much to Open Society Foundation for hosting me and giving me an opportunity to speak to you about this book. And Salaam alaikum. Hope you guys are all doing well this evening. So, where can you find this book? I think that really is hinges on which bookstore you walk into. And the fact that you find it in different places in different bookstores, I think, is a testament to the intersectional work, the kind of broad based work I seek to do with this book. In some bookstores, it's in the American history section, and a heavy component of the book examines American legal, racial, and immigration history. Some books have it in the race and ethnicity section, because as a critical race theorist, the importance of race and racism to my analysis of Islamophobia is extremely important and salient. Some people have it in, ironically enough, and this is problematic, in the Islamic studies or the religion section, because there's a routine sort of, dare I say, Orientalist conflation of anything dealing with Muslim identity as being religious and specifically Islamic. So it's probably harder to find in that section. If I can segue a bit, last night I did a talk at 92 and Y, and the vast majority of the questions I was getting were addressing Islamic law. So having me kind of probe Sharia law questions, which again, go to the idea that just because you're addressing Muslim identity or Islam does not mean you're concerned with examining theological questions. But you can find it in a range of places, which I think can be good. But citing the latter example can be a bad thing as well.
Hmm. Hmm. But Khalid, in all honesty, I want to go to another direction. Um, I'm curious to know why this book,
Mm,
right? Like the question of Islamophobia, as you brilliantly illustrate, has actually been with us
yeah,
for, dare I say, centuries.
yeah.
But it's actually now moved to a new terrain, right? The kind of
Mhm,
watching it be politicized and publicized in a way that we probably haven't seen in at least the last 30 or 40 years.
mhm.
So why produce something that already exists, but it felt like you were trying to do a bit of a refresh?
Yeah. So two reasons. I think there was an immediate kind of political concern to write this book at this time because of the uptick, the intensification of
Mm.
Islamophobia that was ushered in by Trump, now President Trump, when he was a candidate vying for the Republican nomination. It was obviously a very pressing issue that media pundits, scholars, activists advocates were all rushing toward in a very urgent fashion. So that political, aspiration to kind of, address what was happening in real time in the country in a very trenchant way was of critical concern to me. The second objective, which I think was more potent in inspiring me to write this book, was the idea that there was, I think, a lot of flattening of what Islamophobia meant in terms of the way it was being discussed in discursive spaces, specifically the media, but also among scholars. It was refreshing for me as somebody examining this topic and also as a critical race theorist to see that the term Islamophobia had been championed by a broad cross-section of people, but it was not being defined in a way that was doing justice to what was actually happening. So, for instance, when activists were saying Islamophobia, or somebody like Anderson Cooper was saying Islamophobia, they were specifically focused in with what these private actors were doing, right? So, like hate mongers, bigots that are viewed to be deviant or aberrational, right? Individuals that were not acting on behalf of what the state was doing, and second, were not acting on behalf of what broader society was sort of encouraging with regard to animus to Muslims. And I wanted to kind of broaden it to examine the idea that you can't talk about Islamophobia unless we talk about the war on terror and the various apparatuses and laws that the state has been enacting since the aftermath of 9/11, the 9/11 terror attacks. And second, there was this kind of broad sort of Leviathan kind of hovering in the atmosphere called Orientalism, that nobody was connecting modern Islamophobia to this long-standing tradition and epistemology of Orientalism that actually existed in the American imagination before this country was a sovereign nation. So it was doing all those things, first, a political sort of immediate political objective, and second, the broader intellectual piece that derives from my academic scholarship that I wanted to deconstruct in a way that could be accessible to a broader audience.
And that intellectual piece, right? So this goes back to actually how I first met you from critical race theory, right? Pioneered, oftentimes coined by Derek Bell and many others. But usually in the critical race space, you didn't see a focus on Islam or even Muslim populations. So at some level, you're actually engineering something that feels relatively new. And so I'm just curious, so how does one come to this space of merging, and we should also define what critical race theory is, merging critical race theory and Islam?
Great question. So it's a hard one to respond to because it forces me to go back in my own kind of like personal history. But I'll do some autobiographical contextualization that might give you guys some idea as to why I decided to become an academic and specifically a critical race theorist. So the 9/11 terror attacks happened 2 weeks after I was a law student in law school. I specifically chose to go to the UCLA School of Law because it's a school that boasts the only concentration in critical race theory. So UCLA hosts luminaries like Cheryl Harris, who wrote Whiteness is Property, people like Devin Carbato, who's done really important work on the Fourth Amendment and identity performance theory, and Kimberly Crenshaw, my mentor and a good friend of Alvin's, who coined this term intersectionality. Her work has obviously been very foundational to the advancement of critical race theory as a intellectual discipline. So I was in law school at this time examining critical race theory and a range of questions that were grappling with the experience of African Americans, Latinx populations, Native Americans, the struggle of LGBTQ communities, the importance of gender and how it interacts with the law. And I was finding that there was a dearth, if not a complete non-existence of literature examining what was happening with Muslim Americans in real time. So at that point, and I'll be frank with you guys, I didn't think that it was possible for me to be a law scholar because I wasn't somebody who comes from a conventional kind of circumstance where I thought that was possible, right? I'm somebody who flunked freshman year of high school. I transferred to university from a city college. I was a better boxer than I was a writer growing up as a young man, but it was inspirational for me to see scholars of color like Professor Crenshaw and Professor Harris examine the law in a very incisive way from a racial standpoint, and that sort of moved me to want to make that contribution. So back to what you said, Alvin, I was very much, I think, maybe one of the first, if not the first, Muslim American critical race theorist that really tried to merge the canon of critical race theory with what was happening with Muslim Americans, and how Islam was also being demonized as a religion in real time during the War on Terror, but also well before the War on Terror moment. I told Alvin he can cut me off because law professors, we have a penchant for being long-winded.
No, no,
I
no,
talk.
no. No. You're perfect. Do not worry. But I want to pick up something else that the book does that I think is incredibly eloquent and important. You really provide a very rich historical literacy, right? So there are moments when we believe that the experiences that we're having in the real time do not, or
Yeah.
feel they're new to us, but they have historical relevance. And there was a piece in the book that I wanted to read because I think it kind of does a great job of kind of giving us a snapshot, right? And the woman here, her name is Nora, and I just want to kind of read a few sentences that I thought was just breathtaking. This is Nora's voice. "I don't know what to do," she revealed to a circle of family and friends. "Being Muslim in America has always been wrought with scrutiny and suspicion, but the entrance of Trump spelled emboldened Islamophobia, and for conspicuous Muslims like Nora, a far higher likelihood of harm. Quote unquote, acting Muslim today in the United States invites suspicion from the state and maximizes the prospect of backlash from hate mongers. For Muslim Americans who confirm their religious identity by wearing headscarves or Islamic dress, fasting on Ramadan, and regularly attending the mosque, merely practicing their First Amendment rights is perilous. Muslim Americans like Nora, driven by fear to conform, cover, or conceal their Muslim identity, may diminish the prospect of suspicion from the state or backlash from bigots, but in doing so, they are complacent in supporting the very mission Islamophobia aims to advance, eroding and eliminating every manifestation of Islam until it is gone from America altogether." When I read that part, I mean, it's breathtaking for a whole host of reasons, but this public conversation and a desire for erasure.
Yep.
I want to hear more about, when you were doing the research for this, how prevalent was this notion of erasure and this idea or this contention, if it exists, between can I be free to worship and dress as I like, and also be safe and American simultaneously?
Well, for me, when I was writing the book, and Nuda is a young woman I've known from the Detroit community for some time. She was a family friend who evolved into a community activist, somebody who was extremely religiously pious and really struggled with expressing her Muslim identity publicly after the ascendance of Trump. So I had moved back to Detroit, where I'm from, during the campaign moment. And many of you guys might know Detroit is home to one of the most concentrated and actually diverse Muslim communities in the country, along racial, ethnic, and even sectarian lines, and also socioeconomic lines. Detroit is home to a very sizable poor and working class Muslim community. But when I was writing that and when I was engaging with Nuda, I was thinking about the concerted effort to bring about the erasure of Islam from two vantage points, right? There's the historical vantage point, and to me, the history is critical. And to me, the history is, if not entirely neglected, supremely diminished from the way we discuss Islamophobia in the public sphere today. So, being somebody who was really researching legal history, I quickly thought about this naturalization period. The naturalization era is this period from 1790 to 1952. There was a law in place called the Naturalization Act of 1790, which had mandated whiteness as a prerequisite for citizenship. So when we talk about white supremacy today, typically speaking, people are concerned with the most brazen kind of manifestations of white supremacy. However, it's important to know that white supremacy was actually an entire full-fledged system enshrined into every facet of American law. And one of the facets of American law is the immigration legal system. So whiteness, and it's critical to understand that whiteness is more than just phenotype, it's more than just geographic origin, it's also religion. Right? And Islam as a religion was racialized, but it was also deemed and oriented as a rival civilization, if you will, a rival sort of population to Christianity. And Christianity, we know initially Protestantism, was the touchstone of whiteness really early on. Early on, it evolved into being more robustly Christianity. But you see the erasure of Islam and Muslim identity from this period from 1790 to 1944 effectively deployed and made possible through American citizenship and immigration law, right? And to me, the travel ban, which was proposed by Trump on December 7th, 2015, right? Remember on that day, and ironically enough, or maybe not ironically enough, that day is when his campaign became, a real thing. He became a viable candidate on that day. He announces that we have to consider the banning of Trump of Muslims until we know what's going on. And then we see that he enacts it 7 days after he's inaugurated into the White House, tries 2 more times because of the pending litigation circulating through the federal courts. And ultimately on June 28th, the Supreme Court upholds the Muslim ban, saying that the president had the plenary power to impose such a policy on national security grounds. So what happened today is not surprising. When pundits and journalists were saying that the travel ban would never be embraced because it conflicts with American values, that isn't the case. When they say things that the travel ban is unprecedented, that isn't the case. There was a Muslim ban in place from 1790 to 1944 that was upheld by Supreme Court justices and civil court judges. When they say things like this is completely contrary to, American mores and the spirit of the Constitution, that is not true. So for me, it was really critical to highlight the idea that what is happening today is anything but surprising. It's actually foreseeable if we fully put our heads around what happened during not only this dark chapter of American immigration legal history, but a chapter that lasted for roughly 70% of America's existence as a sovereign nation.
So that's excellent. What I want to also go into a little bit more is the history, because when I read this book, I was really impressed by the level of research, right? Like, so you unpack a lot of mythologies that people hold, right? Like, so for many of us, we believe Muslims sort of appear kind of post 9/11.
Yeah.
But you cite the great work of Sylviane Diouf, who reminds folks that the first Muslims in North America were African slaves, right? And so I want to hear a little bit more about, like, how did you come across this notion of actually diversifying what we understand as the Muslim population? Even from the cover of the book, it doesn't fit, the kind of lexicon that most people identify as being of Muslim identity. And that seems like it's a very purposeful strategy, but at the same time, was there pushback from actually exploring the rich diversity of what does it mean to practice?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up Sylvain Diouf's book, Servants of Allah, a book I highly recommend people read. I remember reading that book for the first time as a undergraduate, I think, at the tail end of my time at the University of Michigan. And that book blew my mind. I had no clue that 15 to 30% of the enslaved Africans in the antebellum South were not only originally Muslims, but continued to practice their Muslim identity against the letter of slave code that was imposed in southern states and against the violence of unleashed by slave masters. So for me, reading that book and seeing how Islam was actually wielded as a liberation tool by these enslaved Africans throughout the colonies and even in the North was both surprising but also deeply, deeply inspiring to me, I think. And for me, it was critical after reading that book to root the grand narrative of Muslim Americans and blackness, right? And many of the books that I had read examining the history of Muslims in America had not done that. And you found some scholars do that, but typically tie it to the neo-religious movements that arise in the 20th century, the Science Temple, the Moorish Science Temple, which is one might call it an offshoot of Islam that starts in Philadelphia, the Nation of Islam, for instance. But few scholars, until Diouf comes around, were tying it to the slavery moment. And it's important to do that because in addition to think about Islamophobia as the progeny of Orientalism, right? Orientalism being this master discourse that Palestinian-American theorist Edward Said talks about. It's also critical to tie Islamophobia to anti-Black racism and white supremacy. And we see how Islamophobia is, initially deployed against enslaved Africans through the construction of Blackness, right? The work that Cheryl Harris does in Whiteness is Property is really critical to this as well, to say that blackness was constructed, right? The idea, the classification of blackness was constructed to be synonymous with property or chattel, right? It inscribed the idea of property, stripping citizenship from individuals who were deemed black. And as a consequence of that racialization and that racial classification, enslaved Muslims could not be seen as bona fide Muslims, right? On two grounds: because they were black and deemed property, and part of the way we strip individuals of their humanity is to deny them the ability to practice a religion, right? If you were to allow an enslaved individual to practice their religion, you'd effectively extend them the rights of the Free Exercise Clause of the First Amendment. So the way you maintain that enterprise of slavery is to, I think, most potently deny them the right to practice their faith. But secondly, it's also important to overlay that legal sort of foundation with the idea that Islam was racialized. We understand Muslim identity as a consequence of Orientalism as something that is narrowly viewed in the caricature of Arab, Middle Eastern, and at that juncture, Ottoman identity. So given that enslaved Africans didn't fit within the racial caricature of what we thought Muslims looked like, and second, because they were deemed to be property by slave code and racial classifications created by the new American racial taxonomy, we could not view them as legitimate Muslims. So they were brought, so that double sort of racialization engineered their erasure from American legal history, but also Muslim American history.
You're raising something else that I want to kind of also connect, right? Like, so we're having a conversation about actually how Islamophobia becomes enshrined in law. But there's another part of this where Islamophobia gets kind of enshrined in public attitudes, right? Like, which I think is even more powerful than the legal component, because at some level you have to communicate to the larger audience that this is an issue of threat, right? And so the quote unquote public narratives that get created that are incredibly toxic towards even having folks see Islam as a peaceful space, right? Or Muslim people as a peaceful people. And so we don't have public narratives or even characters in such places in pop culture. And what's interesting to me is that a lot of your current work also really investigates the space of pop culture and religion and ethnicity, right? And in particular, the space of sports arena, right? Where I've always seen like the sports space to be one where we're having a unconscious, conscious conversation about race and politics. So I wanted to hear more from you about how do you bridge the gap between addressing Islamophobia and sports?
Yeah. So my next book, I'm kind of afraid to talk about my next book because promoting a book is a beast, right? Writing a book is one thing, but promoting the thing is a lot harder. And I just turned 40, so running around the country isn't as easy as it used to be. But but my next book is going to examine this sort of like convergence of racism, politics in sports. I'm a former athlete. I'm a big sports fan, and I'm really interested to see how not only Muslims are portrayed in sport, but also how race and racism is sort of informing and driving different athletic arenas. So maybe I'll share two examples that sort of highlight the salience of Islamophobia in sport, and second, maybe more broadly, the importance of I guess race and racism within the broader sporting context. First, I think for those who watch soccer, I'm a big soccer fan, or football. For those who aren't American, don't hit me on top of the head for calling it soccer. And I'm Egyptian also. So last year you saw the ascent of a kind of a wonderkin soccer player from Egypt named Mohamed Salah, who plays for Liverpool and then the Egyptian national team, kind of come out of left field. And he plays for a team in the English Premiership, the kind of the signature English league. Liverpool, which is generally comprised of a fan base that is white and working class. And Mohamed Salah is a deeply pious, traditional, humble Muslim who drops to his knees in praise every time he scores a goal. Last year, he scored 45 goals, so he was doing a lot of praying. So he was doing a lot of praying last year. Kind of the Islamophobe scholar in me was kind of concerned for this guy at first because I knew the context in which he was performing in. And second, if you watch soccer, you know that English soccer fans are also called hooligans, right? They're not the most tolerant of distinct cultures. They can be violent and they can be nativist. But something really brilliant happened with the rise of Mohamed Salah. You saw these white working class fans of his totally embracing him and embracing his Muslim identity in a range of really interesting ways. They had songs singing like Salah la 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 la. If he scores another few, then I'll be Muslim too, right? So it was amazing, and for me, what it did, it made me, and I always kind of look for like rays of optimism because doing this work can walk you down some really dark dark alleys at times. And I'm from Detroit, so I'm used to dark alleys, so that doesn't necessarily scare me, but it was beautiful to see how this young soccer player had captured the imagination of these non-Muslims, but also individuals who might be Islamophobic. And maybe his performance on the field was actually diminishing and retrenching the views they had before. Now, it's kind of tied to this other sort of idea, and this is the reason why I want to write the book. We all know people who study race and examine race really closely, that it always takes an exceptional person of color to transcend and be humanized by individuals that otherwise might not like us, right? So with the good comes the bad, that you got to be exceptional. You got to be Michael Jordan. You got to be Oprah. You got to be J-Lo, right, in order for a broader white mainstream audience to embrace you, right? And you see that same phenomenon happening with Mohamed Salah. A second thing that happened let me pivot to, I used to box, right? I boxed for a long time, so I'm a big combat sports fan. A couple of weeks ago, you had this Muslim MMA fighter, Khabib Nurmagomedov, I can't say his last name, so I'm not going to try. We'll stick with Khabib. Fighting McGregor. And Conor McGregor basically capitalized on this strategy of bigotry to promote the fight, but also to get in the head of Khabib, who's Muslim, who's from Dagestan, which is a majority Muslim province in the country of Russia. And you saw how the UFC, this MMA league, and Dana White, its president, was fully capitalizing and essentially abetting McGregor to say things like calling his assistant a terrorist, to saying that you're backwards because you don't drink, and offering him alcohol, knowing that he's Muslim, at global press conferences, and essentially defaming this man's country, his family, and his religion. So to me, it's really interesting to see how Islamophobia, race, and racism all converge within allegedly the non-political or apolitical context like sport, even though we know that's a myth because sport is inherently political.
So you're raising something else that I want to talk a little bit about, because I think this is very interesting when it comes to questions of race and ethnicity. The public's cognitive dissonance, right? The idea that people can hold competing ideas together, right?
Yeah.
Like, so on one poll that I found, it said the majority of Americans support Muslim civil rights. Okay, so let's hold that. And at the same time, we're having a conversation where assaults on Muslim communities surpass the attacks from 2001, right? So my question to you is, connect those realities for us. How can both things be true if we're seeing a spike in hate crimes and violent acts, but yet the public imagination believes itself to be supportive?
Those statistics are not unlike, and I'm not doing this to dodge, but hopefully the way I answer this provides broader context for why those you have dissident figures in that respect. So, for instance, we see, and I want to tie this to the idea that one of the great myths in America is the idea that we become more racially tolerant and accepting as time passes. The fact that racism actually declines as we move forward. So even though this country, at least from an outward standpoint, becomes more multiculturally accepting, becomes more tolerant in the way it frames its language around ethnicity and race, even though we see the expansion of diversity as sort of being a mandate that's embraced by colleges, universities, private and public actors across the country, we see the retrenchment of race-conscious programming across the board in colleges and universities. You see the number of Black and brown students declining at colleges, especially elite ones across the country. You see the carceral state expanding, more Black and brown bodies in prisons across the country. So it's important to know that there's an outward performance of racial acceptance and religious tolerance that, in my opinion, kind of guises what is happening behind closed doors. And you could tie this to, remember that study, the Bradley effect? I think it was from the 70s. I want to say that people will say they feel one way about certain things when they're surveyed publicly because they want to appear to be accepting and tolerant and so forth and so on. But once they get within those private confines, right, when they go to vote, right, when they're alone and making actual decisions around high stakes mandates, they go the other way because nobody can see them, right? That's why, for instance, even though you see, so I'm really struggling right now with what's going on in the country, and we're going to talk more about this over dinner. I'm not going to tell you guys too much right now because I don't want to get in trouble. But to me, I'm really concerned when I see this this surge in radical leftist social justice movements, especially among liberal whites. But I see figures like 54% of white women voting for Trump. And then when you break down the numbers from a study done by the Quinnipiac study around the Kavanaugh hearings, right? There's a huge performance of largely white women showing resistance and disapproval of the Supreme Court nominating and potentially appointing somebody like Kavanaugh. But their study showed that 58% of white women approve his confirmation. So how do we reconcile these figures with the fact that what's happening statistically is the exact opposite? I think there's a surge in the performance of political correctness happening with a sizable segment of this country that is actually not being coupled with decision-making and action. And that to me is a manifestation of a more concerning form of white supremacy that sort of embraces, sort of the veneer of tolerance, but is actually committed to maintaining the status quo.
Well, something that comes up in the book for me is even the demand for Muslim populations to even take a stronger, more stark approach towards extremism, right? And part of that is, of course, to be publicly protected, but there's also this kind of demand to say that you are not X, Y, Z. So I'm curious to have a conversation with you a little bit more about so what makes those demands so important and where do they find themselves? Because Muslim populations in of themselves, like any population, are dynamic and diverse.
Yeah.
Right? So this demand to denounce extremism and to perform in an Americanized way that sort of eases the burden for non-Muslim populations. So does that make sense? I'm just really curious to hear more about so how did you wrestle with that tension inside, this book while challenging notions of Islamophobia?
So when I was a first-year law student, I read this case Korematsu versus the United States. Are you guys familiar with that?